Growing up, I was taught that a man's role in marriage was clear: work hard, provide for his family, and be the backbone they could depend on. My father was my model for that kind of life, and I vowed that when I got married, I'd live by those values. When I married Rachel, I believed I'd found someone who understood those values too. We'd met in college, and though life had its stresses, we both wanted the same things, or so I thought. After we got married, life moved quickly. I had a stable job with promising career prospects, while Rachel worked as well, though she eventually became a stay-at-home mom when our first child, Ethan, was born. We were ecstatic to welcome Ethan, and a few years later, despite some challenges with conceiving, our family grew again with the birth of our daughter, Sophie. Those early years felt like something close to the dream we'd both wanted. We lived in a good neighborhood, close to schools and with friendly neighbors. Apart from my demanding job, life seemed steady, even ideal. I was determined to give Rachel and the kids the kind of life my father had worked so hard to provide for our family. Rachel seemed to support my commitment to work, especially since we both knew my long hours would eventually pay off. But the balance I thought I had kept started to tilt as time went on. After Sophie's birth, things became more complicated. Rachel and I faced the usual disagreements that any couple might over time. I noticed that some of our conversations seemed colder, as if there was an unspoken distance between us. We tried to work through it, finding compromises and common ground to resolve our issues. But as I got deeper into my career, she grew increasingly restless. The demands of work were relentless, but I could tell that our relationship was slowly slipping into something less comfortable, less certain. And yet, I believed that any troubles we faced were simply bumps along the road of a long marriage. I held on to that belief, hoping that if I kept working hard, providing for my family, everything else would fall into place. Looking back now, I see that there were signs, even then, that we were drifting apart. But in those early years, I thought the foundation of love and commitment we'd built was strong enough to withstand whatever came our way. As the years went on, my work demands only grew, and so did the distance between Rachel and me. Late nights became the norm, and on most weekends, I'd find myself catching up on emails, planning projects, or taking client calls. Rachel would hint, sometimes not so subtly, about how absent I'd become. I'd always respond by reminding her that this hard work was for us, for the future we both wanted. But the more I reassured her, the more I could see her patience wearing thin. "Mark, it's like you're never here," she'd say, her voice laced with frustration. "The kids miss you, and so do I." I tried to brush it off, assuring her that it was only temporary, that these sacrifices would pay off. "Just hang in there," I'd say, "this project will wrap up soon, and things will calm down. We'll have more time then." But things never did calm down. Each project led to another, each promise of more time became another missed dinner, another bedtime story left unread. Rachel stopped asking for specific plans, and I could feel her growing colder each time I canceled a family outing or postponed another date night. It was like a slow drift, so gradual that I barely noticed it happening, but it was there, gnawing away at whatever bond we'd once shared. The kids, too, were starting to feel my absence. Ethan would ask when we could play catch, or Sophie would try to show me her latest drawing, only for me to wave them off, saying, "Later, okay?" They'd nod, disappointment clear on their faces, but I told myself they understood. I was doing this for them, after all. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. One evening, Rachel finally confronted me, her frustration spilling over. "Mark, this can't keep going like this. You're not just missing moments with the kids, you're missing us. I feel like I'm living with a stranger." Her words stung, but I didn't have an answer. I couldn't just quit my job, and part of me resented her for not understanding the weight I carried. "I'm doing this for you and the kids, Rachel," I shot back, more defensive than I'd intended. "You think I like being away so much? This is what it takes to give us a good life." She looked at me, a hint of sadness in her eyes that I didn't fully understand then. "It's not just about money, Mark. We need you here. I need you here. Her words lingered, but they couldn't shake the pressure I felt to succeed, to keep moving forward. I wanted to believe things would eventually get better, that this was just a rough patch. But deep down, I worried that Rachel's patience was running out faster than I realized, and that maybe, just maybe, I was losing her without even knowing it. After years of staying home with the kids, Rachel decided to return to work, taking a part-time position at a local marketing firm. At first, I was happy for her, thinking this would give her a sense of independence and fulfillment. She seemed enthusiastic, and I figured it might even take some of the pressure off me, as she'd have something to focus on outside of our strained home life. But as the weeks went by, I noticed subtle changes in her. Rachel had always been open about her day, eager to share the latest family news or updates from friends. Now, she'd come home and barely say a word about work. When I asked her how things were going, she'd give vague, one-word responses and change the subject. The warmth and familiarity between us felt like it was fading, replaced by a strange distance I couldn't quite place. She started spending more time on her appearance, dressing in ways that seemed out of character. She'd linger in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair, checking her makeup with a care she hadn't shown in years. I couldn't help but feel uneasy, though I tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, she was working in a professional setting now. It made sense for her to dress the part. But the biggest shift came in her schedule. Rachel began working late, telling me about last-minute meetings or deadlines that seemed to stretch far beyond what I'd expect from a part-time job. I'd come home to an empty house, her text messages growing fewer and more curt as the days went by. When I asked her about these long hours, she'd brush me off, saying that work was just crazy busy, or that she had to go to dinner with colleagues. I wanted to believe her, but something didn't sit right. One night, as I waited for her to come home, I noticed she'd left her phone on the kitchen counter, charging. A notification from someone named M popped up, a name I didn't recognize. It was a simple message, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, smiley face." I felt a surge of discomfort, but I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Rachel had plenty of friends from work, and it was probably just a friendly message. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something deeper was going on. She was more distant, more guarded, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. As I lay in bed that night, Rachel asleep beside me, my mind raced with questions I was too afraid to ask. Had I been pushing her away with my constant absence? Was this just her way of finding happiness in her own life, or was there something she wasn't telling me? I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things, but the doubts lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. In the darkness, the thought crept in, unbidden and unwelcome: what if Rachel was hiding something? And what if it was something I couldn't forgive? As the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Rachel's late nights, her secrecy, the message from M, all of it weighed heavily on my mind. I found myself replaying every interaction with her, searching for clues, trying to piece together anything that would explain why our relationship felt so hollow. One evening, I asked her directly about M. I kept my tone casual, trying not to seem accusatory. "So, who's M? I noticed you got a message the other day." For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe even fear, but she recovered quickly, brushing it off with a practiced smile. "Oh, that's just a coworker," she said lightly. "We're working on a project together. Nothing important." But her answer only raised more questions. She'd never mentioned this M before, and her quick dismissal felt too polished, too rehearsed. I wanted to believe her, but each time I tried to convince myself, I felt a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Then, one night, she said she'd be home late again. This time, she claimed it was for a last-minute work dinner that had come up unexpectedly. But as I sat alone at the dinner table, staring at her empty seat, something inside me snapped. I couldn't just keep waiting around, hoping she'd come home and give me answers. I needed to know the truth. With a pounding heart, I decided to check the location sharing app we'd used for emergencies, something we'd set up for the kids years ago. When I opened it, I saw her location wasn't anywhere near her office. It was across town, near a small restaurant known for its quiet, intimate atmosphere. My pulse quickened as I considered the implications, the weight of betrayal settling over me. I stayed up that night, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. When she finally came home, smelling of wine and perfume, she offered a vague excuse about how the work dinner had run late. She was casual, almost indifferent, as if nothing was wrong. But I knew the truth, at least, I knew enough to know she was hiding something. I wanted to confront her, to demand she tell me where she'd really been, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Part of me was terrified of what I might hear. Instead, I held my tongue, deciding to bide my time. But I knew I couldn't go on like this indefinitely. The woman I'd once trusted with everything was slipping away, and I was left clinging to the fragments of a marriage that felt more like a lie with each passing day. As I lay awake, Rachel already sound asleep beside me, I realized that I had to get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. And for the first time, I acknowledged a painful truth: the life I thought I had might already be gone. The tension in our home became unbearable. Each time Rachel walked through the door with another flimsy excuse, each text notification from M, each late night she spent at work only fueled my need to know the truth. The person I loved, the person I'd spent years building a life with, was slipping through my fingers, and I could feel the betrayal tightening around me like a vice. One Friday evening, Rachel mentioned yet another work dinner, her tone casual and practiced, as if she'd rehearsed it a dozen times. This time, I couldn't just sit back and let her walk out the door with another lie. As soon as she left, I grabbed my car keys and followed her at a distance, my heart pounding as I trailed her car through the familiar streets of our town. I kept my distance, careful not to get too close, watching as she took a route far from her office or any known business district. Eventually, she pulled into the parking lot of a small, secluded restaurant, the same one I'd seen on her location tracking app. She parked, stepped out, and glanced around as if checking for something or someone. Then I saw him. A tall man in a dark coat walked toward her, his face obscured by the dim light of the restaurant sign. As he drew closer, she smiled, a soft, warm smile I hadn't seen in years. They embraced, her arms wrapping around him in a way that left no room for doubt. I felt my chest tighten as they shared a brief kiss before heading inside, laughing softly as they disappeared through the door. I sat in my car, numb, watching the scene unfold from the safety of the shadows. It felt surreal, like a twisted dream I couldn't wake up from. The truth was right there, unmistakable, undeniable. Rachel was having an affair, and the life we'd built together was unraveling before my eyes. I wanted to storm into the restaurant, to confront her, to demand answers in front of this man she'd chosen over me. But instead, I stayed rooted to my seat, paralyzed by a flood of emotions I couldn't control. Anger, betrayal, sadness, all of it crashing over me in waves, leaving me breathless. For so long, I'd believed that our marriage could weather any storm, but this was a betrayal I'd never anticipated. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the windows of the restaurant as their silhouettes moved inside. When they finally left, I waited until they'd driven off in separate directions before I turned the ignition and drove home, my mind reeling with questions I couldn't yet bring myself to answer. That night, as I lay in bed beside Rachel, who'd slipped into a peaceful sleep, I realized that everything had changed. The woman I loved was a stranger, and the life I thought I knew was shattered. But one thing was clear: this was no longer a problem I could ignore. I needed to confront her, to demand the truth, no matter the cost. After that night, my world felt hollow. Each day blurred into the next, my thoughts fixated on the image of Rachel in that man's arms, her warmth and laughter given to someone else. But I couldn't let it end there, not yet. I needed answers, some proof to confront her with, something that would finally force her to admit the truth she'd kept hidden. I found myself checking her phone when she left it unattended, scrolling through her messages and emails. I saw little details that stung, exchanges with M hidden under vague work discussions, photos from outings she'd never told me about, and excuses for late nights that were clearly cover-ups. Each bit of evidence was another layer of betrayal, another reminder of the deception she'd woven around our lives. But that wasn't enough. I needed to see it firsthand, to know how long this had been going on, and how deeply she was entangled with this other man. I started following her regularly, noting patterns, times she'd leave and come home. The calm, composed routine she'd put on for me was only a mask, hiding the life she was leading without me. One evening, she left for another work dinner, and I trailed her again, my heart pounding as I kept a careful distance. She drove to a secluded park this time, pulling into an empty lot where he was already waiting. They embraced again, his hand brushing her cheek as she leaned into him, laughing like she hadn't in years with me. Watching it unfold, I felt the sharp sting of loss, anger simmering beneath my pain. Back at home, Rachel would act as if everything was normal, going through the motions with a practiced ease that left me reeling. I found myself unable to look at her the same way, knowing the secrets she carried behind that familiar smile. At night, lying next to her felt unbearable, and I'd lie awake, replaying every moment, every small sign I'd missed. As the days passed, my focus at work suffered, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Rachel and her affair. I was living in a silent prison of my own making, bound by the knowledge I couldn't yet confront. But the more I learned, the clearer my path became. I couldn't let her keep taking advantage of me, deceiving me day after day. I needed to make a plan, to confront her in a way that left no room for denial or deflection. And as the weight of that decision settled over me, I knew that the confrontation, when it came, would change everything forever. The life we'd built was already crumbling, and all that was left was to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After weeks of carrying the weight of Rachel's betrayal alone, I knew I couldn't continue like this. I needed to talk to someone, to let out the thoughts that had been haunting me day and night. I decided to confide in the one person I trusted above all else, my son, Ethan. One Saturday afternoon, I asked Ethan to join me for a walk around the neighborhood. We strolled in silence for a while, each of us lost in thought, before I finally worked up the courage to speak. "Ethan, there's something I need to talk to you about, something important." He looked at me with concern, sensing the heaviness in my voice. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully, and told him about Rachel's late nights, her secrecy, and what I discovered about her meetings with M. I tried to keep my voice steady, but as the words spilled out, I felt the raw pain resurfacing, knowing I was now sharing that burden with my own son. Ethan's face shifted from concern to shock, and then to an anger I hadn't expected. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low. "Dad. I thought something was going on too. I saw her once with someone else. I didn't want to say anything because I hoped I was wrong." Hearing that my son had noticed it too, had witnessed the same betrayal, struck a chord deep within me. We'd both been living under this shadow, each carrying the weight of suspicion and pain alone, and now it was out in the open, undeniable. I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude that he trusted me enough to share his own suspicions. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I murmured, my voice filled with regret. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you and Sophie from this." He shook his head, his expression firm. "You don't need to apologize, Dad. None of this is your fault. Mom, she made her choice." His words held a wisdom beyond his years, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of strength return. Ethan's understanding and quiet support gave me the courage I needed. I could no longer let Rachel's lies poison our family, driving a wedge between us. I would have to confront her, not just for myself, but for Ethan and Sophie too. Our family deserved better than this charade, and I was ready to bring it all to light. As we finished our walk, I felt a sense of resolve settling over me. Whatever happened next, I knew I wasn't alone. My son was by my side, and together, we'd face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The day after my conversation with Ethan, I still hadn't confronted Rachel. I wanted to find the right moment, to approach it in a way that wouldn't create more chaos than we were already enduring. But fate had other plans. That afternoon, while Rachel was out, Sophie approached me, her face flushed, her hands shaking as she held Rachel's phone. "Dad. I saw something I think you should know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at me, a mixture of confusion and sadness in her eyes. I took a deep breath, knowing instantly that she'd found out the truth in the worst possible way. She handed me the phone, and there it was, a string of messages between Rachel and M, filled with terms of endearment, meeting arrangements, and a closeness that left no room for doubt. Sophie had seen the reality of her mother's betrayal, the words on the screen unraveling the trust she'd once held. Tears brimmed in her eyes. "How could she do this to us, Dad? To you?" My heart broke seeing the pain in her face. I pulled her into a hug, struggling to find words that could ease her hurt. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know why she chose this path," I murmured, holding her tightly as she sobbed. I felt my own emotions threaten to spill over, but I kept them in check for Sophie's sake. I had to be strong, to show her that we'd make it through this, even if it meant facing some hard truths. The confrontation I'd been avoiding was no longer a choice, it was necessary. Rachel had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and now her betrayal had hurt not just me but our children, tearing at the very foundation of our family. Ethan joined us in the living room, quietly offering his support to Sophie. As the three of us sat together, a sense of unity began to form, a resolve that we would face this together. That evening, as we waited for Rachel to come home, the atmosphere in the house was tense, charged with anticipation. I knew the conversation to come would change everything, but I also knew it was time. The lies, the betrayal, they had to end. When Rachel finally walked through the door, she took one look at our faces and froze, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. And as I prepared to confront her, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. This was our moment of truth, and for the first time, I was ready to face it head-on, no matter the outcome. As Rachel stood in the doorway, her eyes darted from me to Ethan and Sophie, she knew the time had come. Her face was pale, and she seemed to grasp the weight of the moment, though she stayed silent, waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath, feeling the anger, hurt, and betrayal all pressing down on me at once. "Rachel, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady but laced with the emotions I'd kept buried for so long. "The lies, the late nights, the secrecy, it's all out in the open now." She looked away, her hands fidgeting, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she sighed, as though she'd been carrying the burden for too long. "Mark. I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this." "Then why?" I demanded, my voice louder than I intended. "Why did you lie to me, to our family? Why did you let it go this far?" Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a trace of regret. "I don't know," she whispered. "I felt disconnected, lonely. You were always busy with work, with everything but me." Her words struck deep, but they didn't excuse what she'd done. I'd worked hard for our family, and instead of coming to me, instead of letting me know she needed more, she'd chosen betrayal. "If you were unhappy, Rachel, you could have talked to me. You didn't have to do this behind my back, to lie and destroy the family we built." Ethan stepped forward, his voice filled with pain. "Mom, how could you? We trusted you." Rachel's face crumpled as she looked at Ethan and Sophie, realizing the depth of the hurt she'd caused them. I didn't want you to find out this way. I was going to end things, I swear." The words rang hollow. They weren't the promises of someone who cared about our family, they were excuses, attempts to salvage something that had already shattered. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "We can't go on like this, Rachel. You made a choice, and now we all have to live with it. This isn't just about you or me. It's about Ethan and Sophie, too. Sophie wiped her tears, her face resolute. Mom, I can't believe you do this to us, she whispered, the hurt raw and open. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything Rachel couldn't take back. Her betrayal had changed our family forever, and there was no returning to what we'd once been. I looked at her, realizing that the woman I'd once loved, the person I'd believed in, was now a stranger. Rachel, I said finally, my voice quiet but resolute. You need to leave. She nodded, the reality of her choices settling over her as she gathered her things and left without another word. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Our marriage was over, but in that moment, I also felt a new beginning, a path forward with my children, free from the lies that had torn us apart. The days following Rachel's departure were a whirlwind of emotions. The house felt emptier without her, but there was also a quiet peace that filled the space, a sense of calm that had been absent for too long. Ethan, Sophie, and I leaned on each other as we adjusted to this new life, each of us carrying our own scars but finding strength in our bond. In the evenings, we began new routines together. I made an effort to be present, to really listen to Ethan and Sophie, and to make up for the time I'd spent buried in work over the years. I realized now how precious these moments were, how much they needed me, and how much I needed them, too. Ethan and I started going fishing on the weekends, a tradition I hadn't kept up since he was young. We'd talk about life, about his future, and I was surprised by the resilience and maturity he'd developed through this painful experience. Sophie, too, found her own way of healing. We began cooking dinner together, experimenting with recipes and sharing laughter that helped to soften the ache. My focus at work shifted, too. I no longer allowed it to consume me the way it once had. I'd learned the hard way that time with my family was something money couldn't buy, and I was determined not to let the mistakes of the past define our future. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Sophie looked up at me, a soft smile on her face. Dad, I'm glad we're still together, she said quietly, and Ethan nodded in agreement. I am, too, I replied, feeling a sense of gratitude that went deeper than words. In the midst of heartbreak, we'd found our way back to each other. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought us closer, giving us a strength I hadn't known we possessed. Over time, the pain of Rachel's betrayal faded, replaced by a resilience that allowed us to move forward. I knew that life wouldn't always be easy, but as I looked at my kids, I felt certain that we'd weather any storm as long as we had each other. Our family, though changed, was still intact, and together, we were rebuilding a new life, one based on trust, love, and a commitment to being there for each other. As I looked around the dinner table that night, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, knowing that, in the end, we'd found a way to heal. And that, above all else, was worth everything.